All right, everybody, good morning to you all. We're thankful for your presence. It's a beautiful, crisp Sunday morning. Feels like it should be October instead of late August, but we're very thankful for that, I know. We are studying the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, and we are going to be in Isaiah chapter 53 as we were last week. We're going to finish the chapter this morning, so go ahead and open your Old Testaments there, Isaiah chapter 53, and we're going to begin in just a moment in verse number 6. So as I've said before, just to refresh what we're doing with this class, we've broken the subject matter into three parts. And it's not part one is death, part two is burial, because burial is just, it's a quiet weekend. Nothing happens. Very little happens. And then resurrection. It's not like that. Instead, the way we're breaking it up is this month, which this week is the last one of this first part, we're looking at the predictions. Some things said about the death of Christ, the upcoming death of Christ from that perspective. Not only from a literal prophetic perspective, we've been studying Isaiah here and there this month, but also from Jesus' own words as he talks about his death that was upcoming in Galilee and during his ministry, and then also as he prays about his death just before it happens in Gethsemane. So we are looking at it from a future tense perspective. So obviously we're still going to look at the prophets, which is why a few weeks ago we started in Isaiah 52, where the prophet says you're going to go into captivity, you're going to go into exile, but you're going to come out and the Messiah will be there and you will be saved, not just from a physical conquest, but from a spiritual one. God is going to roll up his sleeves and get to work saving you. That's chapter 52. And then the high price to pay for that salvation is what Isaiah 53 is concerned with. But as we noted last week when we looked at just the opening few verses, the focus of the chapter is not just abstractly separated from all things, just kind of from an academic standpoint, let's just consider all that he suffered. No, you're supposed to make it personal. And that's why we really emphasize those personal pronouns in that critical verse. He was bruised for our iniquities, suffered for our sins. He took the chastisement of our peace upon him. He did all of this. He didn't have to endure any of it. He didn't deserve to endure any of it. He chose to endure all of it for me. This is a very personal kind of chapter. And so it picks up right where that left off, though there's less of a focus on the personal and more on the mechanics of it. What's the purpose behind this? What exactly is God accomplishing in the bringing death to his Messiah? That's what the second half of the chapter really zooms in on. So look at verse number 6 of Isaiah 53. The prophet says, "All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned everyone to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all." There are two of the most common ways to describe the Messiah is, ironically, traditionally opposite words. One is Jesus is a shepherd. He guards over us. He guards and directs us. We use that all the time in our prayers. Those are shepherding phrases. He's a shepherd. He leads us to the still water and so forth, as David says in Psalm 23. So Jesus is a shepherd. But the other way we always think of Jesus is a sheep. He is a sheep. He is a lamb. He is a perfect lamb. He is a representation of the Passover lamb offered to pass over God's judgment over us so we don't have to endure it. He'll move beyond it. But he is also a representation of the Day of Atonement lamb, the scapegoat animal, the one whom the high priest would place his hands on and say, this animal represents the sins of the people. And there were two different animals, one that was going to be killed and one that was going to be set free, both representing a propitiation, a sacrifice for someone else, and also a freedom that follows. And Jesus encompasses that lamb idea as well. And you see that here in this verse. We're the sheep, but the Lord laid on him the iniquity of us all. We're the sheep who abandoned God our shepherd. So what did God our shepherd do? To bring us back, saw a man so meek that no matter how much injustice and abuse he endured, he never said a word, not against those doing it, not even in his own defense. Now think about that. The worst of us would fight back and attack and want to hurt those who hurt us. And of course, Jesus says that's not what we do. The average of us, and probably among us, we would say the best of us, we would have the idea of, well, I'm not going to fight back, but I'm at least going to speak in my own defense. And I maybe can talk them out of persecuting me. Hey, you've got the wrong guy. I didn't do this. I didn't do that. Have you considered these good things that I've done? So maybe we can, you can feel guilty and you won't want to attack me. But Jesus doesn't even do that. He doesn't attack those who hurt him. He doesn't speak in his own defense to potentially mitigate the hurting him. He says nothing. He opens not his mouth, which is beautifully illustrated here by the prophet, again tying him in with being a sheep in verse 7. He says, like a lamb brought to the shearers is mute. King James says dumb, silent. So he opened not his mouth. He could have said countless things in his defense, not just from the perspective of his divine nature, but just in terms of his humanity, all the good that he has done to make him so unworthy of what he endures. But he doesn't say any of it. And what's amazing about this more than anything is that you can see the character of Jesus here. Because it's very easy for me to stand here and say, oh, we should not want to punish our enemies, as I said just 38 seconds ago. We should not want to punish our enemies. We don't do that. But it's so easy to do that. And I know from experience, we've all been there. But with Jesus, He was the one who said, love your enemies. Do good to them that persecute you. Pray for them that despitefully use you. That is Jesus. He said those words on the Sermon on the Mount. And then 3 years later, He was given the opportunity by the devil to be a hypocrite or to live up to them. He was given the opportunity to put His money where His mouth was. And He did. He chose not to do those things that He preached to us not to do as well. And He could have opened His mouth. I mean, if he wanted to, He could have said many things in His own defense. And there's so much about the arrest of Jesus and the trial of Jesus and the actions that led up to the actual nailing of Christ to the cross that is so unworthy of anyone. If it was a modern American legal system, He would have been freed on a mistrial at least. And the evidence would have been thrown out, or whatever the case they had against Him would have been rendered inadmissible because of all the unjust things done along the way. For example, He was arrested at night, which was supposed to be illegal. He was arrested under the word of one of His own gang, Judas, who betrayed Him, which is supposed to be, you need more testimony than just someone of your personal group who you have a now obvious vendetta against. During His trial, the high priest, in a fit of rage, rips his clothes, which in that culture doesn't mean much to us, but it was a cultural expression of just frustration and upset and anger, which according to the Torah was supposed to install an instant recess in the trial. If the judge shows obvious emotion against the defendant, there should be a recess. Let's just cool heads. Let's relax. Let's let the facts handle it. But that didn't happen. There was no pausing in the trial. They just kept on going. There was no crier who went out among the streets, as there should have been when someone was arrested, the town crier, to say, hey, so-and-so has been arrested on such and such a charge. Who can speak in his defense? Who will defend his character? Who can say that he wasn't there or was there? Who can provide testimony? That didn't happen, because everything about the trial was supposed to be hush-hush. Let's just hurry and get the verdict. And when the verdict came, who was the first one to say, we know he's guilty? You've heard it with your own lips, he's a blasphemer. We know he's guilty. Who said that? The high priest. The judge, the top of the judge. Of all the Sanhedrin that was gathered there, the eldest, most senior statesman was the one who said he was guilty. Why is that important? Because when the Sanhedrin makes a verdict, the verdict is supposed to be youngest to oldest. The youngest, least experienced member is supposed to offer his verdict, guilty or innocent, first, so that he doesn't feel pressured. If the older one, the more experienced one, offers a verdict of not guilty, it kind of pressures me to go along. Or if he says guilty, it kind of pressures me to want to say guilty too. But that didn't happen here. Again, it was the eldest, the most senior, the most authoritative voice who says, well, we know he's guilty. Well, who's going to speak up in his defense? As we'll read in just a moment, nobody will. Nobody will speak in his defense. Nobody outside was allowed to, and no one in that room did either. So yeah, he had many things he could have said, yet he opened not his mouth. Look at Isaiah 53:8. He was taken from prison and from judgment, and who shall declare his generation? For he was cut off of the land of the living, for the transgression of my people. Isaiah says, don't forget why this is happening. For the transgression of my people, he was stricken. Throughout his trial, he is treated unfairly, illegally, unjustly. And incidentally, the courts of men should have no jurisdiction over God. And yet they put God on trial. And God let them. That's amazing. That's the meekness of Christ here. You don't even have the right to make an accusation against God, according to Psalm 143. And yet they arrested him. They made heinous accusation. And he just sat there and took it. I'm reminded of something Jesus says to Pilate in John 19, and we'll cover it here because we won't get to it later when we study Golgotha. But John 19, 10 and 11, Pilate said to him, "Do you speak not unto me?" Because remember, he's been talking and Jesus wouldn't speak. Are you not going to talk to me? "Do you not know that I have the power to crucify you or the power to release you? I'm your only friend here," he says. Jesus answered, "You could have no power at all against me unless it was given to you from above. Therefore, he that delivers me unto you has the greater sin." The Jews understand the relationship with God that Pilate doesn't. The Jews are the ones who are behind this. Pilate is just the spaghetti-spined politician going along with it. God is the orchestrator of this. God is the one who has the plan of all this. It is the Jews who have been doing all this. You really have no part to play in this at all, Pilate. He allows the trial to proceed. And during it, as Isaiah says in the verse, any semblance of justice is taken away from him through the use of oppression. The King James says from prison and from judgment. Prison's a bad translation. The word is oppression or through mistreatment. Through that avenue, judgment was taken away from him. Through being mistreated, treated wrongly, justice was denied him. Listen, and I'll say this, I said it last week, I'm going to say it right now, and I'm going to put a spin on it here in just a second. But last week what I said, and it's still true if you look at it a certain way, is Jesus got what he didn't deserve so that I could get what I didn't deserve. Does that make sense? I don't deserve heaven. I deserve hell. I deserve punishment from God. Jesus did not deserve the cross. He endured the cross. He got something he didn't deserve so that I could get something I didn't deserve. Okay, that's all true. And that's coming out right here. But you can easily flip that and look at it a different way, which we will in just a second. But the point here is that point, which is he was oppressed, and the consequences of it was he was denied justice. He got what he did not deserve. He got what I deserved, in other words. Look at the next verse. Verse number 9, Isaiah 53. "And he made his grave with the wicked, and with the rich in his death, because he had done no violence, neither was any deceit in his mouth." That last phrase may be familiar from the words of Peter, as he's preaching to Cornelius. There was no guile, the King James says, no deceit. There was nothing the man ever said there was anything wrong with what he was or who he was. But look at the beginning of the verse again. "He made his grave with," the King James says, "the wicked." It's actually with wicked ones. And with a rich, singular. One's plural, one is singular. "He made his grave with wickeds, and with the singular rich in his death, because he'd done no violence, neither was any deceit found in his mouth." Now, let's break this down, because it seems like, well, what does that exactly mean here? Because if you're familiar with the circumstances of the immediate aftermath of the crucifixion, Jesus was buried in the tomb of a rich man. And that's alluded to here. But what should have happened, what was traditional to happen, is whenever the Romans crucify someone, that is a dishonorable death. Because you have, if you're being crucified, with every case except for one, Jesus, you have done heinous, horrible, wicked, cruel things that the state decides you're worthy of the worst kind of death possible. And so they're not going to give you an honorable burial to follow a dishonorable death. So what they did was they just dug a hole in the ground right behind where they hung you and nailed you to the cross, and then they just tossed your body in whenever you finally died. So that should have been the fate of Jesus. He should have been put in a hole and just left, forgotten forever. Like, we don't know exactly where. We think we have the idea. Gordon's Calvary and the other potential hillsides that we look at outside of Jerusalem, we say that was the spot. We don't know exactly. In fact, there's even a place in Japan where they say this is where Jesus died. I don't know how he got us all the way over there, but the people just don't know, and so they come up with their own ideas. But the point is, if the Romans had had their way, if things had gone according to type, he would have been buried and just forgotten. But Jesus is not the type to be forgotten. And so circumstances intervened, and his death was given much more specialness. As you know, Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, the same from John chapter 3. They went and they pleaded with Pilate to get his body. And they took his body down and they laid it in the tomb that belonged to someone else. It was unused, but owned by someone else. And so both things are alluded to here in verse number 9. The death he should have gotten, the burial he should have gotten, and the burial he actually did get, the one in the tomb of the rich man. And so here is the circumstances of this person and this burial and all that he endured. He did nothing wrong. So at least in his burial, he did not get a dishonorable burial after living such an honorable life. So, looking at the first 9 verses, we're about to start verse 10. We covered the first 5 last week. Here's the next 5. Looking at these first 9 verses, the emphasis is this. Here is a person who suffered, though he didn't deserve to suffer at all, who endured more than anyone could ever imagine enduring. And he did all of that for us. It wasn't just that he was going to suffer anyway, so God just said, well, I can use that. I can make that work. No, this was the plan. And it was a plan that had to be carried out because of our sins. Because God knew we would sin before we ever sinned, He planned in motion before the beginning of the world the potential for Jesus to die, and then carried out that plan on Calvary. That's how vast the love of God is. That's how eternal in scope the love of God is. He's had all this planning. And so the first 9 verses of this chapter is about reflection on that and how unworthy we are for that. Now look at it from God's perspective in verse 10. Here is Jesus. We're looking up on from Calvary's foot at Him on the cross. When we go to our mind's eye, I don't think there's one of us who views it from a bird's eye perspective. When you picture Calvary, are you not looking up at the cross? That's how I always see it. You look up at the person who is dying on the cross. Well, God is going to be looking down on the person. He's going to be looking from heaven's vantage point. What does He see? I see a bloody, bruised, battered person. I feel guilt and remorse and sorrow and shame when I look up and see him dying. Isaiah says in verse 10 that God looks down and it pleases the Lord to bruise him. Now that's the King James. Does anybody have a different translation than please? Ryan, what does yours say? Huh? It was the Lord. Yeah, that's just an interpretation. It's fine interpretation. That's exactly what the word means. Don't hear the word please and think God was happy. God was not happy. Jesus was not happy. He was in agony before, during the crucifixion. No, my master, my Father in heaven, was heartbroken, and yet he was pleased in the sense that justice was done. Justice was satisfied. In fact, that might even be the best translation. God was satisfied to see it. Because something had to be done to cover our sins. Something needed to be done to free us from Satan's grasp. And when Jesus died, God said, that'll do. That does the job. That satisfies my need for justice. And I said this when we had the new conference class for like 2 weeks before everything shut down. And we were talking about the concept of salvation from the vantage point of God. And the point that I made then, and I'm going to reiterate it right here, is that God could have just killed all of us for our sins. We were once sinless, we were perfect, pure, and then we chose to sin, and we became imperfect and corrupted. And God could have killed us, but think about it from the standpoint of justice. If God kills a sinner for the crime that was first done by a sinless person, because that was you, the first time you sinned, you were sinless and then sinned, right? So if He's going to kill a sinner for the crime of a sinless person, that's not just, that's not equal. Justice demands equality. So God could have killed us and never sent Jesus, and that would have been vengeance, and God would be right to be vengeful. He could carry out vengeance against us, but it would not be just, because justice demands equality. So something just must be done, and thus to save a sinless person, He must kill a sinless person. Well, none of us are sinless. We've all sinned. Oh man, I talked too long. You're going to have to sit tight because I'm not done. He chose not to kill a sinner. He chose to kill a sinless person to make it justice as well. And that's why it's important. Yes, it's true to say He got what He didn't deserve, so I could get what I didn't deserve. It's absolutely right to say, I deserve to die. Yes. Listen, because of Jesus, it is now just for me to be saved. Like before Jesus, it was just for me to go to hell. That was justice. Now, justice can be heaven. You are now worthy of heaven. You didn't earn that. Jesus bought that for you. And if you don't say that, and if you don't think that, you undermine what He did on the cross. He made it so you could be just. 1 John 1:9. He is just to forgive. When I sin and I confess my sin, 1 John 1:9, He is faithful and just to forgive. Me being forgiven is an act of God's justice. And we don't think of it that way because we stew in our guilt over the death of Jesus. But Jesus would say, don't stew in it. That's done. I've already died. And now you can be freed. Now you can be saved. Unburden yourself from the guilt of the past I've washed away. That's what's going on here. God looks at Jesus and He was satisfied at what was accomplished so that I could be righteous in the sight of God through His blood. Very quickly, same idea in verse 11. God will see, we're going to examine that in more detail when we go to the cross. He will see the travail of His soul and be satisfied. Here's what He did, and that accomplishes justice. Verse 12. Because of that, he gets rewarded. I will divide him a portion with the great, divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out his soul unto death, numbered with transgressors, bore the sin of many, and made intercession for the transgressors. In other words, he died between people who deserved to die to free them from the death they deserved. And because of that, he'll be rewarded. Whew, is that the last verse? Yes. Whew, I did it. We're 2 minutes over time, but that's okay. You're free to leave if you want. That was the predictions section. I'm sorry I had to blaze through the last couple of verses there. But that is the prediction section of our class. Next week we start the Passion. Next week we go to Gabbatha, the slab, the place on which Jesus was beaten, battered, bloodied, and bruised before he went to die. So we've seen him talk about it. We've seen it contextualized by Isaiah. We've seen as Jesus prayed about it, and we've listened to Isaiah explain it. Next week, we'll go to the Passion, and we'll see him when he endures to save us from our sins. That's all I have for you. Thanks you guys very much.